This morning, when I woke, I even had the impression that I was not home, but in a horrible, unfamiliar place. It seemed, but I hesitate to say this, that the sky framed within the window was not open and pure, but marked and divided, as if by a sinister black shadow, and, God, a grating. And why is this room empty of every kind of furniture whatsoever? And why is the bed I just stepped out of a mere cot? Why do the dulled walls seem, oh, God, save me from the horror, padded? Why is it impossible for me to move my arms and hands as if they were bound across my chest? A mocking or perhaps compassionate face, though it makes no difference, is observing me from a peephole in the door. If only I could reach it, I swear that person would never scoff or pity anyone again. Or perhaps the face belongs to Enrichetta herself, come to relish her triumph. And above everything, dominating everything, the mover of it all, is Labrina. Once again, how did it get in if no one ever enters this room, not even my wife? And how can I protect myself from it, in this condition? It watches me with its round, bulging, glittering eyes. It scans for the opportune moment to come to me, to come face to face with me. It watches me with its round, bulging, glittering eyes. It scans for the opportune moment to come to me, to come face to face with me. It knows its own gaze, its tremendous power. It holds within all the world's evil, all the world's suffering. My God, save me. There's an excerpt there from Tommaso Landolfi's De Labrinas, which is from the collection Words in Commotion and Other Stories, which was published by Penguin under the Viking imprint in 1986, one of the three English translations of Landolfi, alongside Gogol's Wife and Other Stories, which was 63, and Cancer Queen and Other Stories, which was 71. There's some overlap between these collections. I can't actually remember how I came across Landolfi. Someone recommended him to me with my love of weird stories, basically. And there's not much really known about him, and he's not spoken about that much anymore. But this collection, in its absurdity and its just pure enjoyment of both the literary form and its sort of almost outrageous and courageous content, I went through in a couple of sittings. It's just thoroughly enjoyable for anyone who's interested in anything adjacent to even Ligotti or Joao Luis Borges or Calvino or Edgar Allan Poe or Gogol. Landolfi is someone to look at. As per usual, I've got some excerpts and I'll jump into the themes, but I want to talk about how this collection is structured first, and really what we're looking at when we go into Landolfi, because I didn't know what to expect at all. And so this is a collection of short stories, but arguably not all of this is fiction. That's not to say that the other stuff is explicitly non-fiction where he's writing about himself. It's only that the book is split into sections titled such as fantastic stories, obsessive stories, dialogues, and then between autobiography and invention, love and nothingness, little treatises, words and writing, okay, and also horrific stories. And so one isn't really sure what to expect, because there's such a wide array and diversity in terms of Landolfi's clear enjoyment, not of just the history of literature, but his ability to interweave constant stylistic references and thematic references throughout all the stories. I will say that the fantastic stories section, which was more phantasmagorical, more along the lines of magical realism, and more just plain weird, was the strongest section for me. And when he's working in purely the form of a short story, I think Landolfi is best, at least in this collection. The dialogues I found a bit weaker, and the autobiography I wasn't as enthused by. And for me, that's because the stories, just to go through a few, and there's one I want to focus on in particular. So the first story there, and there's a lot of spoilers here, and Landolfi is an author of surprise, an author of strange shock, we could say. He's brilliant at endings. Endings are difficult for any writer, and Landolfi is just fantastic an ending. So to give you an overview of a few of these stories and what the content and really what happens in them, so there will be spoilers, but the first story, the Labrinas, is about a man who initially is so terrified of basically a small lizard, which I looked up and I'm actually not sure it exists. So he's made up some sort of small lizard that he's so petrified by that when it finally does touch him, he actually dies. But instead of just dying in the story, he dies but is aware of his death, and he's carried through in the coffin and he's hearing all these conversations. So he dies, is put in the funeral home, then put in the coffin, and he's aware of all this, and he's buried. But during the funeral, he overhears a conversation between his wife, his then widowed wife, and another man, where they actually have a kiss, and then he shrieks at the funeral and comes back, and eventually, as per that section I read out, it actually turns out that he's locked in an insane asylum and is going mad, and is still haunted by this strange lizard. A shorter story, which is straight after this one, called Chicken Fate, is about a chicken farmer who is paranoid that they're feeding chickens too much growth hormone and that chickens are getting too large. And then ominously, there's a lot of strange sounds and screaming starts to happen. And it turns out that the chickens have got so large that they have now penned in the human beings. And then for me, the story, which is the title story of the other collection, Gogol's Wife. Gogol's Wife, I think, is just one of the best short stories I've read. And I found it absurd, beautifully written, and uproariously funny in its absolute ridiculousness. But at the same time, strangely haunting in how sincerely it treats its subject matter. And this is one thing that is mirrored by Italo Calvino in his introduction, is that Landolfi's oddness, Landolfi's absurdity, is so potent because the stories are not only worlds unto themselves, but they are faithful only to themselves. And so there is this sort of extreme sincerity of what is happening is absolutely, of course, it would happen. And you're never taken away from that. And so the endings come as an acceptance, and then you're sort of jolted into the ridiculousness of it all. But to give a couple of excerpts from Gogol's Wife, which I would assume is the sort of the most famous Landolfi story in English. Let me just find the pages here for you. So this is from Gogol's Wife. Gogol's wife, it must be said, was not a woman, nor was she a human being, nor a living creature of any kind, nor an animal or plant, as some have insinuated. She was simply a doll. Yes, a doll. And this well explains the bewilderment, or worse, the indignation of some biographers who were also personal friends of our man, and who complained they had never seen her, although they frequented her great husband's house quite often. Not only that, they had never even heard a voice. Hence, goodness knows what dark, disgraceful, and perhaps even abominable complications they may have inferred. But no, gentlemen, everything is always simpler than one might believe. You never heard her voice simply because she could not speak, or more precisely, she could only speak under certain conditions, as we will see, and in all those cases, except one only to Nikolai Vasilievich. But let me dispense with useless and facile refutations, and let us work toward the more precise, complete description possible of the being or object in question. Gogol's so-called wife, then, looked like a common doll made of thick rubber, the hue of flesh, or as it is often called, skin colour, and was nude regardless of the season. But since women's skin is not always the same colour, I should specify that hers was generally somewhat fair and smooth, like that of some brunettes. It, or she, was in fact, but must this be said, of the female sex. Indeed, let me add immediately that she was highly fickle in her characteristics, although obviously she could not change her sex. Yet without a doubt she could appear thin, almost flat-chested and straight-hipped, more like an ephebe than a woman, on one occasion, and on another, exceedingly buxom, or to put it plainly, plump. She frequently changed her hair colour, as well as the other hair on her body, sometimes to match and sometimes not. Thus she She could also alter other minute particulars, such as the placement of moles, the colour of her mucous membranes, and so on, and even to a certain extent the actual colour of her skin. Therefore, ultimately, one must ask oneself what she really was, and if she could speak of her as a singular being. Yet, as we shall see, it would not be wise to insist on this point. And so, in relation to the writer Gogol, who notoriously biographers couldn't figure out stuff to do with his wife, as I understand it, Landolfi has constructed this story around people visiting Gogol and finding out that his wife is a strangely made doll of rubber that within the story is sitting completely fine and normal and is described in Landolfi's style, which is plain. It flows. He's very easy to read, but he's a very, very calculated writer who almost doesn't want to lead you astray. And in not being led astray, and not being led into tricks and masks such as Borges, you're given these images of Gogol with his naked, rubber-made doll wife sat completely normally, and the unsettling friction between those two modes is just absolutely absurd. So Gogol's wife is actually called Caracas, and as we go forward through the story, which is very, very short, there's this whole question of whether or not she can speak, whether she's just sat there and whether or not she can speak. So a longer excerpt here. And now I think I have covered all the notable particulars of this being, except to remark upon the stupendous row of little teeth which graced her mouth and her brown eyes, which, despite constant immobility, feigned life perfectly. Good Lord, feigned is not the word for it. Indeed, one really cannot say anything legitimately about Caracas. The colour of those eyes could also be modified through a rather long and tedious process. Yet Gogol rarely did this. And finally, I must speak about her voice, which I had occasion to hear only once. But first I must touch upon the relationship between the spouses, and here I can no longer proceed randomly or answer anything with the same absolute certainty. I could not do that in good conscience, for what I am about to relate is too confusing, inherently and in my own mind. Here, nevertheless, are my memories, as chaotic as they may be. The first and indeed the last time I heard Caracas speak was on an intensely intimate evening spent in the room where the woman, if I may be allowed this verb, lived. Nobody was permitted to enter. The room was decorated in somewhat of an oriental style, had no windows, and was located in the most impenetrable corner of the house. I had not been unaware that she spoke, but Gogol never wished to clarify the circumstances under which she did. There we were, you see, the 2 or 3 of us. Nikolai Vasilievich and I were drinking vodka and discussing Budkov's novel. I remember that he digressed from the topic a bit and was insisting on the need for radical reforms in the inheritance laws, and we had nearly forgotten her. And then, in a hoarse, meek voice like Venus in the nuptial bed, she said point blank, "I have to go poop." I gave a start, thinking I had misheard, and I looked at her. She was sitting propped against a wall on a pile of pillows, and on that day she was a soft, gorgeous blonde and rather fleshy. Her face seemed to have taken on an expression bordering on maliciousness and cunning, childishness and scorn. As for Gogol, he blushed violently and leaped onto her, thrusting 2 fingers down her throat. As she began to get thinner and, one might say, paler, she took on that look of astonishment and befuddlement that was truly hers, and at last she shrunk to nothing more than a flabby skin covering a makeshift framework of bones. In fact, since she had an extremely flexible spine, one can intuit how this made for more comfortable use, she nearly folded in half, and she continued to stare at us for the rest of the evening from that degrading position on the floor where she had slid. "She is either being nasty or joking," Gogol muttered, "because she doesn't suffer such needs." He generally made a show of treating her with disdain in the presence of others, or at least with me. So, what we have here is a completely sincere story where, in a metafictional sense, Gogol is brought into the story as a very real writer and a very real piece of lacuna, emptiness regarding, a lack regarding his biography, which is concerning his wife. And Landolfi is inserting into this an absurd situation wherein Gogol created a doll wife made out of rubber who we now aren't really sure if she's alive or real or what the hell is happening, and whose only words are, "I have to go poop." And it's absolutely ridiculous, but as the story goes on, the sincerity with which it's treated makes it all the more insane to imagine and visualize these 2 men sincerely talking about inheritance laws, sat around a deflated piece of skin with a flexible spine just laying on the floor. Now, as the story continues, and I won't read any more excerpts from this one, as the story continues, we get to the point where Gogol becomes sort of almost seemingly self-aware of the situation, and the whole thing collapses, and what he does is, by inserting a tube somewhere in her body, I'm sure you can guess where, he inflates Caracas to such a degree, and this is described in intimate detail, to the point where she explodes. The flesh and the rubber is strewn around the whole room in a complete explosion of this doll wife's body, and Gogol begins shoveling the pieces of his rubber doll wife into the fire and chanting over and over again, it has to go, it all has to go. But we're left in this situation, which we took as readers to be entirely fine and real. And what comes through in Landolfi is his ability as a stylist to utilize, and also he was a notorious, I mean notorious in the sense of a lot, translator. So he knew his literature to a high degree. And so we're immersed within a style that in any other novel would take us sincerely just through a general narrative or story. And we have to deal with that given the situations. And there's something about it that's utterly fantastic. But thematically, so many of these stories are horror stories with the fright and the terror and the horror. They're horror stories without the horror, which doesn't really make much sense. What are you really left with? Even weird fiction usually is reliant on elements of horror to imbue in the reader that feeling of strangeness and dread. Maybe someone who comes close, actually, though not in style or anything, but other than feeling, would be Ballard, whose stories feel like they should be in the weird fiction genre because something is liminally awry, something is unresolved, and yet there's not horror. And so with Landolfi, this is exactly what we have, is a black romanticism, a dark romanticism, something gothic without the goth, something horrifying without the horror, a strange just, why am I sat in this room with this doll? And behind that, it's very much like another author that I've reviewed many times now, Herman Berger, in the sense that behind all these things is an emptiness, is a nothingness, is possibly a nod towards death. But as per Berger, who's leaning in towards that in a highly hyper-pessimistic way, Landolfi is leaning towards that in a very dark form of joy. All these stories are joyous in their absurdity, and it just makes for absolutely fantastic reading. And he's also, as with endings, and as great as he is with endings, he's also fantastic with openings. And this is from the short story Uroxicide. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Murdering people is easy. I've never understood all the fuss murderers make, or why they still haven't brought off or perpetuated the perfect crime. It must be simply that they haven't studied their victims closely enough. Take me. When I decided that I wanted to, indeed that I had to, murder my wife. Huh? What? Why did I want to have? Why did I want or have to kill her? Don't play the hypocrites. Don't make me laugh. If you take any husband and wife, it's obvious that one of the two individuals is too many. In any case, this is not the place for explanations. You only need know this, that I had to kill my wife, and here is how I attended to this necessity. So that's how he opens Uroxicide, and then just a couple more excerpts. The other thing, two more excerpts just to expand the thematics, because alongside the short stories, there's a clear, in relation to writers like Kafka, Borges, Poe, maybe even Joyce, there is a philosophical streak. There's a streak of trying to get over some abstract ideas, some philosophizing about life and the meaning of life, without betraying it by giving clear answers. And so these are often brought into stories. And these are stories that often fail. There's a calculatedness that isn't wasteful. When Landolfi gets to the point where all has been said, almost like the writing of Daniel Kahneman's, he isn't afraid to just end things. He isn't afraid to blow up the doll. He isn't afraid for the chickens in the Chicken Fate story to just peck people to death and not have these sewn up endings. It's this notion of the unresolved that doesn't come across as a horror and cheap, that you're just imbued with a sort of dark mystery that makes Landolfi great to read. But when we get through to an abstract, a sort of a tale called an abstract concept, which is sort of a fairly lengthy philosophical dialogue between multiple characters, it ends like this. And so the whole thing is dialogue other than this. But just then something happened suddenly that truly put an end not only to the lesson, but to the entire course, and to all good. The sky, the whole sky, was lit as if by a frightening aurora borealis, and in no time those drapes, trails, fringes, curtains, and swords of light turned a violent and wicked scarlet colour. The entire visible universe burned and bled. In several seconds the temperature rose millions of degrees, and one brief second later the stellar earth that had sheltered those relentless speakers exploded. One can't even say thundered apart, because there was nobody left to hear that great thunder. I must confess how providentially this cosmic catastrophe coincided with the then intolerable boredom I, the telestographer, was suffering. So I must now ask myself, what did eternity want to show? That death not only occurs on those remote galaxies, but actually reigns supreme? Or did it simply want to punish those good people for their peculiar quibbling? How petulant they really were, and what fools too! How can anyone get so excited over things everybody knows? And full of pretenses and an obsession for speculation. Alas, in this regard they didn't let up. They would grab any little word and start to pour it as if it were a woman's breast, if you will. But truthfully, was that speculation? Instead of rowing on a great river, they threw themselves into little riverlets and splashed about blissfully like little beavers, without any thought to the connections, the relationships, and everything else that made our real speculation glorious and supreme. Yes, fine, but what about the poor fellow like me who had to sit there and listen? Yet, it's undoubtedly preferable to adopt their point of view, and I'll tell you the wherefore. There was one thing those people were undoubtedly right about. No matter what eternity may do, death does not occur. It simply doesn't. Thus, some part of them must still be, even if they are out there rambling. And since they are indeed out there rambling, their spirit, or some part of it, may well have entered one of our bodies. And everyone, save the creators of speculative science fiction and galaxoids and nebuloids, has some self-respect. And so after this very so-human long discussion of death and the meaning of life, Landolfi decides to burn the entire universe up, because what can really be said? And so he's not afraid as a writer at all. There is also there's a tale called A Woman's Breast. There's a strangeness to Landolfi's understanding of death and understanding of purpose, in which a man is focused solely on a passing woman's breasts, happens to save her life, and she is adamant that she owes him a debt. And what does he want to do? He wants to kiss one nipple, which, when revealed, is basically a sort of garish, aged, horrible gothic horror of a nipple, that then this whole situation has to be resolved once again in the exact same style as given to us in Gogol's Wife, the short story. And yet Landolfi seems to largely have been forgotten. It's my understanding that this short story collection, Words in Commotion, has quite a lot of overlap with the other short story collections, and yet I think he would find a place now. I think perhaps in Italy there's a different culture around Landolfi, but now I would place him as a precursor to even Ligotti, to Thorough would emphatically place him within. We could arguably call him a hidden father of weird fiction. I think there isn't the requirements needed to when one reads a Borges, for instance, or God forbid, a Joyce. But there isn't the horror of Poe or Ligotti again. There is something just joyful about the absurdism of it all. And it's the unresolvedness and stories that are faithful to themselves. And in a sense, I don't have too much. There isn't always a complete depth and complexity to them. Sometimes, as per Chicken Fate, the story of the large chickens, they're a great fun. But it's Landolfi's ability to root you within these stories, and for you to take them seriously in their obsessiveness and their detail and their arguable, just subtle seriousness and arguable neuroticism, that we just just fall into the language, which somehow carries you along beautifully, and yet isn't necessarily that purple. It isn't necessarily that over the top or needless. And so there's something here that carries you along. And I think what it is Landolfi's sometimes explicit, leaning towards just some human desire to know what the hell's going on, and our perhaps innate need to just accept it because we want that control. But in this acceptance, the chickens were just that large. His Gogol, I guess, did just have a wife that was made of rubber and exploded. We are still left with no resolution because we can't really accept it. And so these are tales which really scratch at an absurd itch to be just lost within a silly world, a seriously silly world, for a while. And it's just truly enjoyable, which was the best thing about it. And they likely will be very difficult to find now, but if I can find any more Landolfi, I would pick it up in a heartbeat. Read these whenever. They're very short, very quick, and they pack a fantastic punch. But that is my very short review and thoughts on Tommaso Landolfi's words in Commotion and Other Stories. Thanks for listening.